ESG regulations that label food production as high risk. Sounds crazy, right? Well, in January, the EU's controversial ESG regulations came into force, and they've been described by their proponents as the most ambitious yet. And if that wasn't crazy enough, the provisions in the regulations don't just apply to companies in the EU. They apply to non-EU companies which work with EU companies and possibly even to consumers as well. Today, I'm going to explain the EU's ESG directive, tell you which provisions are most troubling, and reveal why the elites are so obsessed with ESG. Firstly, a bit of a recap. ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, and it defines an investment trend that's been pushed by financial elites since the start of the pandemic. In short, ESG states that environmental, social and governance issues are more important than production output or profits. Logically, this imperative is incompatible with basic economics. Purposely pursuing more expensive energy sources, hiring people based on their personal identity rather than their abilities, and letting governmental and non-governmental organizations make business decisions is a recipe for disaster. ESG's incompatibility with basic economics is why it's more accurate to refer to ESG as an ideology rather than an investment methodology. Any company that complied with ESG criteria would quickly find itself out of business. This is why the ESG ideology was mostly ignored for the first 15 years of its existence. If you watched our first video about ESG, you'll know that the term was coined in a 2005 report written by the United Nations, the World Bank and the Swiss government. You'll also know that ESG criteria were inconsistent and unclear, which contributed to their lack of adoption among businesses. Now, this all changed in mid-January 2020, when BlackRock CEO Larry Fink wrote an open letter to all the shareholders of the companies the asset manager is invested in, ordering them to comply with ESG. For context, BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world, with $8 trillion in assets under management. In late January 2020, the world's elite gathered in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, or WEF's, annual conference. There, the Big Four accounting firms standardized ESG criteria with the help of an organization headed by Bank of America's CEO Brian Moynihan, who is another key ESG player. If you watched our video about digital ID, you'll know that ESG criteria have since become synonymous with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Now, for reference, the SDGs are a set of 17 goals which are supposed to be met by all 193 UN countries by 2030. The overlap between ESG and the SDGs comes from the strategic partnership the WEF signed with the UN in the summer of 2019. The announcement states that the WEF will help, quote, accelerate the development of the SDGs. In other words, they will provide the private sector funding and compliance. Besides the development of digital ID, SDGs mandate the development of things like smart cities, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, and carbon credit scores to track and reduce your consumption. All these technologies are being developed by companies closely affiliated with the WEF. But, as I mentioned a few moments ago, ESG is incompatible with basic economics. This begs the question of why the private sector is on board. Well, the short answer is artificial profits. Companies which comply with ESG get lots of investment from asset managers and better loan terms from megabanks. Companies which refuse to comply with ESG see investments pulled and risk losing access to financial services altogether. Meanwhile, on the public sector side, they risk unreasonable regulations and bad press from governmental and non-governmental institutions working with these asset managers and megabanks. This terrifying situation comes from the unnatural accumulation of wealth caused by a financial system where limitless amounts of money can be created. TLDR, asset managers and megabanks borrow lots of money at low interest rates, then use this money to buy assets and influence and push their ideologies. Make no mistake, the ESG ideology would not exist in a sound money system. It would not be possible. Now, although the ESG push has come primarily from private sector entities affiliated with the WEF, there are a few public sector exceptions, and the biggest one seems to be the European Union, or EU. Lo and behold, the EU's ESG initiatives have their roots in the Next Generation EU Pandemic Recovery Plan. Not surprisingly, the implicit and explicit purpose of Next Generation EU is to help all European countries meet the UN's SDGs by 2030. The recovery plan is expected to cost over €1.8 trillion. In other words, it provides the public sector funding and compliance, complementary to the WEF's initiatives. 1/3 of all this printed money will fund the EU's Green Deal, which was likewise announced at the start of the pandemic. Now, to give you an idea of just how ideological the Green Deal is, one of the 3 goals noted on its website is to ensure that, quote, economic growth is decoupled from resource use. This impossible goal is why it's appropriate that the EU's ESG regulation is part of the Green Deal. The ESG regulation in question is called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. It was first introduced in April 2021, was passed in November 2022, and went into force this January. There are just 2 caveats here. The first is that the CSRD is technically a directive, not a regulation. Whereas an EU regulation requires all EU countries to comply with the EU law as it's written, an EU directive allows EU countries to adjust the EU law and take their time rolling it out. Confusing, I know. This ties into the second caveat, which is that going into force and being enforced are 2 different things. While the CSRD went into force this January, it won't actually be enforced until 2025. In fact, the ESG reporting standards themselves won't even be published until June this year. To clarify, ESG reporting standards will be published in June. In 2024, EU companies will start collecting data using these standards. In 2025, this data will be reported. A spokesperson for the agency tasked with setting these standards recently specified that over 1,000 ESG data points will need to be reported. In a December 2021 interview, one of the architects of the CSRD revealed that the purpose of the directive is to, quote, bring sustainability reporting to the same level as financial reporting. He also revealed that all of the reported data will have to be digitized and that this won't be easy or cheap. Naturally, failure to comply with the EU's ESG disclosures will result in sanctions, which should be, quote, effective, proportionate and dissuasive. The CSRD will require governments to publicly shame the companies that didn't comply, order them to stop violating ESG criteria, and, of course, fine them. The CSRD is expected to apply to around 50,000 companies operating in the EU, but the real figure will probably be much higher. This is in large part because of the absurdly low bar for what counts as a large company. An EU company counts as a large company if it meets 2 of the following 3 criteria. It takes in more than €40 million per year, has more than €20 million worth of assets, and/or has more than 250 employees. Publicly listed EU companies will also be required to comply with the CSRD regardless of their size. Moreover, the CSRD will also apply to non-EU companies which meet the following criteria. Takes in more than €150 million each year for a 2-year period, and has a subsidiary in the EU, or has a branch that takes in more than €40 million each year. Another big reason why the CSRD will apply to more than 50,000 companies is because of extremely concerning provisions in the CSRD, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, could apply to small and medium-sized businesses inside and outside of the EU, and possibly even to consumers. The most problematic provision is called double materiality. As per Big Four accounting firm KPMG, double materiality, quote, requires companies to identify both their impacts on people and environment, impact materiality, as well as the sustainability matters that financially impact the undertaking, financial materiality. Now, double materiality sounds like yet another buzzword at first listen, and its definition sounds no different. However, these two meaningless words open the door to forcing small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and possibly even consumers to comply with the CSRD's ESG reporting requirements. This is simply because double materiality requires companies directly affected by the CSRD to collect ESG-related data from individuals and institutions which lie upstream and downstream from their actual business operations. So, let's use the example of a car company to explain just how problematic this is. Okay, suppose you're a car manufacturer in Europe that falls under the CSRD. Making cars requires lots of raw materials, but let's say the biggest components are steel, plastic, and rubber. Imagine you buy your steel from a Russian company, your plastic from a Chinese company, and your rubber from a Thai company. It's January 2024, and the CSRD has gone into force. This means that you have to start collecting extensive ESG data. In addition to your own ESG data, you have to ask your largest suppliers to give you their ESG data because of double materiality. Note that this is just the upstream part of the provision. Now, by this point, you've made some cars that were sold through car dealerships and purchased by EU individuals and institutions. Because of double materiality, you must ask your largest consumers to provide their ESG data for your reporting purposes. This is the downstream part of the provision. So, fast forward to January 2025. It's time to report your digitized ESG data. Unfortunately, you couldn't collect any ESG data from your largest suppliers and only collected some ESG data from your largest consumers. Fortunately, you don't get fined because the EU went easy on companies for the first year. There's no evidence that the EU will go easy on companies in the first year, but let's roll with it. Now, because you're determined not to get fined in 2026, you decide to switch suppliers for your steel, plastic, and rubber and become more selective with whom you sell to. This puts your car company into bankruptcy, but BlackRock invests in you and Bank of America gives you a loan, so you stay afloat. It's now January 2026, and this time you manage to get all your largest suppliers and consumers to provide detailed ESG data. There's just one problem: they all scored poorly on ESG. They don't use enough renewable energy, their workforces aren't diverse enough, and they're not members of the WEF. Remember, environmental, social, and governance. BlackRock and Bank of America see your annual ESG report and inform you that they won't be able to provide any more financial support unless you force your suppliers and consumers to improve their ESG scores. They're kind enough to provide you with a list of ESG-compliant suppliers and consumers. As expected, most of the list consists of companies that only exist because they've likewise received extensive financial support from BlackRock and Bank of America. You notice that a few companies on the list are not ESG compliant. They're just good friends with the UN and the WEF, so they get a pass. You decide to take the high road by convincing your existing suppliers and consumers to improve their ESG scores because you'd rather work with them than some UN or WEF crony company. By some miracle, you succeed, but you encounter another problem related to another so-called stakeholder. You forgot that under the CSRD, you don't just answer to governments and investors. You must also answer to the so-called silent stakeholder, which is nature itself. Believe it or not, but it's the unelected and unaccountable NGOs which represent the interests of nature under the CSRD. It turns out that someone at the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, heard that you read their now deleted article about weather modification being done in over 50 countries as of 2017. They've also heard that you're not convinced that ESG compliance will ever fix the environment because of this fact. They even know that you've been sharing a downloaded video from Coin Bureau breaking down the facts about weather modification before it was deleted from YouTube in compliance with the EU's online censorship laws, which went into force in the summer of 2023. This is a real thing, by the way. Because of this, the WMO gives you a low ESG score, and since nature is the most important stakeholder, BlackRock and Bank of America stop providing financial support and your company finally goes bankrupt. You tried so hard, you got so far, but in the end, compliance got you nowhere. Note that you can check out our video about weather modification using the link in the description. Anyways, if that elaborate example didn't make it clear enough, the CSRD has the potential to impact individuals and institutions around the world. Large companies in the EU will bear the brunt of the burden. The time and money it will take for them to report ESG criteria will be a massive expense. Any small or medium-sized businesses which lie upstream or downstream from these large companies will likewise be required to report, and the expenses for them will be even greater in percentage terms. Never mind the costs and the surveillance that will come with digitizing all this sensitive ESG data. And that's not all. If you watched our summary of the WEF's Davos conference in 2022, you might recall me summarizing an ESG panel where the panelists said that small and medium-sized businesses will eventually have to comply with ESG if they want to get investments and loans from financial institutions. One of the panelists gave an example of compliance with the social criteria of ESG, stating that small and medium-sized businesses must pay their employees a, quote, fair wage. This is code for paying their employees as much as a big business can, which small and medium-sized businesses often cannot do. With the CSRD applying pressure from the public sector side and ESG investing applying pressure from the private sector side, it's more than likely that many small and medium-sized businesses affected will go bankrupt. Now, as far as the elites are concerned, big business taking over everything was always inevitable. The only things that will protect small and medium-sized businesses from going under will be investments from asset managers, loans from megabanks, and grants from governmental authorities. This will give them the power to pick winners and losers based on their compliance with the ESG ideology, not on output. Assuming this ESG ideology continues to grow, we could very well see a scenario where businesses are occasionally prevented from providing goods and services to consumers on ESG grounds. Excuses could include things like climate change, social inequality, and the inability to track what's been purchased. Again, basic economics says this would not be sustainable, but printed and borrowed money would make it so. The EU could achieve its goal of having economic output with zero input. It would just be numbers on a screen going up, with inflation kept in check by capital controls on digital currencies. Quality of life would quickly crater, as no actual inputs means no actual outputs. There would be frequent and chronic shortages of critical goods and services, which the elites will blame on the same crises that ESG claims to solve. Real inflation, if it's allowed to be discussed at all, will be off the charts. So, this brings me to the big question, and that's why the elites are so obsessed with ESG. Well, the answer is obvious when you realise that the primary byproduct of ESG policies is what I just mentioned a few seconds ago: inflation. ESG policies create inflation, and that's why the elites are so obsessed with ESG. In case you haven't noticed, the wealthiest individuals and institutions have trillions of dollars of debt that they can't ever hope to pay back. By now, you'll know that most of this debt was used to buy assets and influence, all to push dystopian ideologies which go against the natural laws of economics. In theory, Most of the issues that ESG seeks to fix could be more easily fixed with a sound money system. Saving is incentivized, the accumulation of wealth is hard, and harmful ideologies are harder to finance. In practice, this would mean the elites default on their debts and lose all their assets and influence. That's why there's only one solution in their eyes, and that's to centralize control so intensely that it becomes impossible for them to default. This requires controlling where you go, what you say, and how you spend. When you step back, you'll realize that this is the true purpose of the SDGs and of ESG. Now, the silver lining is that the elites are unlikely to succeed in implementing ESG policies. If you want evidence of this, look no further than last summer and autumn, when energy prices were through the roof. Anti-ESG rhetoric went through the roof with them because people knew ESG was the ultimate cause. Funnily enough, ESG saw a comeback after energy prices fell, but this isn't going to last long. That's because the fundamentals of the energy market still haven't been addressed. There's a huge lack of supply relative to demand, and energy companies are reluctant to expand in the face of ESG opposition. When energy-driven inflation comes back, and it will, ESG will become public enemy number one again, and rightfully so. When energy prices spike, you'll see governments declare oil, natural gas, and nuclear energy as green and spend $500 billion to burn dirty coal to keep the lights on, like Europe did. And that's just what will happen in the developed world. In the developing world, entire countries will go under. There'll be revolutions and mass migrations, and all those angry people will know that ESG is ultimately to blame. This will lead to global instability, which will thwart the UN and the WEF's plans. Now, the elites are hyper-aware of this, which is why they're trying to move quickly to take control of everything before the purchasing power of their filthy fiat currencies goes completely to zero. They will fail because people will opt out of the current system when they start to see it closing in on them. They'll opt out by adopting alternative technologies like cryptocurrency, which have been in development for years in preparation for this exact transition. As fiat currencies implode, the current system will collapse and an alternative system will emerge. Let's hope it's different next time around. Thank you all for watching, folks. Please like and subscribe, consider sharing this video, and look out for the next one. I will see you then.